They called him broken, unfit, not even worth the bullet to put him down. Left behind at a dusty livestock auction, this old German shepherd had no name, no future, until one man, an aging veteran, quietly stepped forward and changed everything. What began as an act of mercy would soon uncover secrets buried deep in silence and scars. Before we dig deeper into this tale, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel, tap that like button, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another heartwarming story. Now, back to that rainy afternoon in El Paso, where a forgotten dog and a forgotten soldier crossed paths and saved each other without even knowing it. In a dusty auction yard just outside El Paso, Texas, time seemed to stall. Rain tapped steadily against the tin roof, casting a rhythm over the dimly lit barn. A German shepherd lay motionless on the concrete floor, ribs visible, fur patchy, scars telling a story no one cared to ask about. $50 to start, the auctioneer called, his voice barely convincing even himself. Laughter rolled through the small crowd like tumbleweeds. Not worth the bullet to put him down, someone muttered. Old war dog, probably more trouble than he's worth, another sneered. At the back of the room, a wooden chair scraped. Slowly a man rose, tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath a worn cap stitched with fading letters. U.S. Army, 1969, 71, I'll take him, the man said quietly, his voice rough like gravel, but firm. The room fell silent. No one asked why. No one questioned what an aging veteran wanted with a broken-down dog. But Frank Delaney didn't need to explain. He had seen that empty stare before, in mirrors, in foxholes, in too many brothers lost to time. He stepped forward, pulled 2 damp bills from his coat, and took the leash. As he turned to leave, the dog didn't resist, didn't growl, didn't move, but Frank felt something, a tension in the air, like the first moment before a storm. Not fear, recognition. Outside, thunder cracked as the old soldier and the forgotten war dog disappeared into the Texas rain, and neither knew it yet, but they had just saved each other's life. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Frank pulled into his ranch, an aging stretch of land tucked between the dry hills of West Texas. The wind whispered through the mesquite trees, and a hawk circled high overhead, silent witness to the homecoming of 2 battle-worn souls. Frank parked the truck beside the barn. The shepherd lay curled in the back seat, unmoving, not asleep, not relaxed, just waiting. You coming out, soldier? Frank said softly, his hand resting on the open door. The dog flinched, but didn't growl. His eyes met Frank's briefly, haunted, watchful. Then, slowly, painfully, he stepped down from the truck. Frank didn't lead him inside. He didn't force the leash. He just walked, and after a moment, the dog followed. The ranch house stood quiet and worn, like its owner. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, black coffee, and time. Frank set a bowl of water near the fireplace and placed a blanket on the floor. He didn't say much. He knew from experience that the quiet could speak louder than words. He settled into his old armchair, cracked leather creaking as he leaned back. The dog remained by the door, standing, never sitting, never blinking, as if any second someone might strike. I don't know what they called you before, Frank said after a while, voice low and steady, but around here, you're Buddy now. 'Cause I figure that's what we both need. The dog didn't respond, but his ears twitched. That first night was long. Thunder rumbled on the horizon as a storm rolled in. Frank stirred his coffee, staring out the window. Buddy refused the food, paced the room, then finally lay near the front door, body rigid, ears up. At midnight, a sudden crack of thunder sent him into a frenzy, growling, lunging, slamming into the wall as if trying to escape a memory. Frank didn't shout, didn't move fast. He just sat on the floor and started talking about nothing and everything, about the ranch, about the old war, about a friend named Tommy who didn't make it back. The dog circled, uncertain, confused, but he didn't bolt, and eventually the storm passed. Morning came with a golden light spilling across the prairie. Frank brewed his coffee, fed the chickens, checked the fence line. Same routine as every day. But now there were two shadows walking behind him. Buddy never got close, never let Frank touch him, but he followed, step for step, ears alert. When they returned to the house, Frank turned to the dog. "You're a good boy. Nobody told you that in a long time, huh?" Buddy looked up just for a second, then looked away. That afternoon, Frank took out an old photo album. Dusty pages held black and white memories, young men in green fatigues leaning on tanks, smiling like they hadn't seen hell yet. "You remind me of my squad," Frank said, flipping through the pages. "They always said I didn't smile much. Guess I needed someone like you back then." The dog shifted closer, just an inch, but Frank noticed. The sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Buddy stood at the door, staring at the open land like he was waiting for orders. "You don't owe me anything, boy," Frank whispered, stepping out onto the porch. "But you're safe here. No more yelling, no more pain, just peace." Buddy didn't move, but his tail gave a single, slow wag. That night, Buddy slept beside the fireplace. Not soundly, not deeply, but it was the first time he closed his eyes in front of another living soul. And Frank, sitting in his chair with a blanket over his knees, felt something inside him shift. It wasn't just the dog that needed saving. Maybe they both did. A week passed on the ranch, and slowly rhythms returned. Frank rose at dawn, brewed his bitter coffee, fed the livestock, and took long, quiet walks along the fence line. And wherever he went, Buddy followed. Never too close, never too far. A silent shadow, always watching. He still wouldn't eat from Frank's hand, wouldn't tolerate being touched, but he slept indoors now, near the fire, his breathing soft but shallow, like he never quite trusted sleep. Then came the morning when Frank noticed something new. Buddy had refused food for 2 days straight. His gait had stiffened. When he tried to lay down, he winced. Barely, but Frank caught it. That afternoon, Frank picked up the phone and called an old acquaintance. Claire Hensley was the county's only veterinarian, semi-retired, widowed, and just about the only person in town who didn't look at Frank like he was already half buried. She arrived in a cloud of gravel dust and denim, carrying a worn leather bag. "Frank Delaney," she said, stepping out of her truck. "Haven't seen you since my husband's funeral. You're the only one I trust with him," Frank replied, nodding toward the porch where Buddy stood rigid, staring. Claire's smile faded. "That's not just a dog, Frank." She approached slowly, but the moment her fingers touched her medical bag, Buddy changed, his hackles raised. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his throat, primal and raw. Claire froze. "That's not fear. That's trauma." Frank stepped between them, hands raised. "He's not aggressive. He's scared." Together they backed off. Buddy didn't attack, just stood guard, chest heaving, eyes wild. Claire studied him carefully. "Those scars around his neck? That's from a prong collar, a heavy-duty one. And the way he limps, it's not old age. Those are training injuries. Someone pushed him too hard, too fast, and too long." Frank's eyes narrowed. "You think he's military?" Claire nodded. "I've seen a few over the years, retired working dogs. Some do okay, others—" She looked toward Buddy, whose tail was tucked so tight it was nearly invisible. Others carry it like a second skin. Frank said nothing, but a storm had begun to brew in his chest. That night, he sat by the fireplace, sipping coffee that had gone cold. Buddy lay nearby, head on his paws, half asleep but twitching, eyes flicking beneath closed lids. A whimper escaped him. A dream. No, not a dream. A memory. Frank leaned forward, voice low and steady. I know those nights, Buddy. The ones that never end. Where you're running, but you never get away. The dog stirred but didn't wake. Frank reached out, just inches. His fingers hovered above the shepherd's neck, then stopped. Not yet. Instead, he pulled a faded envelope from a drawer. Inside, a newspaper clipping from 2 years ago. A military auction notice. Among the items listed, retired working dog, male, aggressive, final placement before euthanasia. Frank felt the pieces click. The scars, the posture, the fear of touch, and beneath it all, discipline, training, purpose once. But someone had stripped it all away. The next morning, Claire returned. This time, she left the medical bag behind. I made some calls, she said. There's no public record of him, but I found someone who works in military canine placement. Off the record, she said. Some dogs fall through the cracks, especially ones with behavior issues. Frank's jaw clenched. Behavior issues? Or just trauma? They don't always know the difference, Claire replied softly. They stood in silence, watching Buddy sniff the fence line. He moved slowly, but with precision, checking weak spots, marking boundaries. Not like a house pet, like a soldier still on patrol. Frank turned to Claire. He's not broken. No, she agreed. He's just been used up and thrown away. Buddy turned then, just briefly, and met Frank's eyes. There was no wag, no sound, just that same look of recognition Frank had seen the day they met. They were both still fighting, only now they didn't have to fight alone. The next few days were quiet, but Frank's mind was anything but. Every move Buddy made added weight to Claire's suspicion. The way he scanned rooms before entering, the way he positioned himself with his back to a wall, how his ears twitched at distant sounds, like he was always on alert. That wasn't instinct. That was training. Military, deliberate, and hardwired. Frank couldn't let it go. He spent hours digging through old paperwork, making calls to long-forgotten contacts, people he hadn't spoken to since his army days. Most offered condolences, some offered silence, but one, an old buddy from the VA, sent him something different. A name, Project Sentinel, an off-the-book training program for combat dogs attached to private contractors. No official records, no oversight, and no accountability. Frank sat back in his chair staring at the message on the screen. So that's what they called it. Later that week, he drove 2 hours to the State Archive building, clutching nothing but a slip of paper and a burning need for answers. There, in the dusty records room, a sympathetic clerk helped him find a shipment ledger from an airbase in Nevada. 6 dogs transferred to a civilian handler training program after being retired. No names, just microchip numbers. He snapped a photo of the page and sent it to Claire. Minutes later, her reply came back. I scanned Buddy's chip while he slept. One of those numbers matches. Buddy wasn't just a military dog. He had been buried, hidden under red tape and silence. That night, Frank stood at the porch, arms crossed, watching Buddy pace the edge of the yard. The moonlight painted silver streaks across the dry Texas dirt. For a moment, it looked like the dog was patrolling a perimeter again. Frank sighed. You didn't just serve, did you? Buddy stopped, turned. The question hung in the air. You saw something, Frank said softly. Something. They didn't want anyone to know. Buddy walked over slowly, not all the way, but closer than ever before. He sat, alert but calm, ears forward. Frank lowered himself to the step, joints protesting. They tried to erase you, but they didn't finish the job. He pulled a folder from under his arm. Copies of the documents, the shipment records. A blurry black and white photo from a report marked confidential. It showed a shepherd. Lean, scarred. Frank held it out. Is this you, buddy? The dog's gaze fixed on the photo, then shifted. Up to Frank. Something passed between them. Not memory, maybe, but recognition. Like staring into the past and finding it staring back. The next morning, Claire arrived with more than just supplies. She had a visitor with her. Frank, she said, stepping out of her truck. This is Sarah Baker. Her husband was a Marine, killed in Afghanistan. She's been looking into these programs for years. Sarah was in her 30s, her expression worn by grief that had been folded and refolded too many times. She carried a box of files and a small envelope. My husband wrote about a dog in his last letter, she said softly. Said it saved his unit from an ambush. Smartest dog he'd ever seen. Brave as hell. Frank nodded, motioning to Buddy, who stood near the porch. Sarah's eyes filled. Oh, that's him. She handed Frank the envelope. Mike told me if anything ever happened, I should give this to someone who could finish what he started. Inside were photographs, handwritten logs, notes about unauthorized training techniques, and, most chilling of all, reports labeling several dogs as unstable shortly after they returned from deployment. They weren't unstable. They were witnesses. Frank stared down at the documents, his jaw tight. This wasn't neglect, he said. It was a cover-up. Claire nodded. They didn't want anyone to know what these dogs had been through. Buddy, lying nearby, let out a low breath. For the first time, his body was relaxed, not curled tight like a spring. He was listening. He knew. Frank looked toward the horizon where the sun was rising over the hills. We're not done, he said quietly. Not until someone answers for what they did to him and the others. Buddy stood, walked over, and sat beside Frank, not at a distance, not behind, right beside him. The wind picked up just after sunset, carrying a chill that didn't belong in a Texas spring. Frank was on the porch, his shotgun leaning beside him, untouched. He wasn't expecting trouble. But trouble had a habit of finding men who asked too many questions. Buddy lay by the steps, alert but calm. He didn't sleep much these days, but he rested easier now, closer to Frank, closer to home. Since Sarah Baker's visit and the discovery of the files, something in him had shifted. Not all the way, but enough. Enough to trust. The envelope she brought had been a spark. Frank had sent scanned copies to 2 trusted contacts, one at the local sheriff's office, another an old Army friend with connections in D.C. They'd promised to look into it. Frank had heard that line before. That night the moon was a sliver in the sky. No stars, no sound. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Buddy stood first, his ears perked, nose twitching. Frank noticed the shift in his posture. Shoulders forward, tail down, but steady. Not afraid, prepared. Then came the sound. Tires on gravel. 3 vehicles. No headlights. Frank rose slowly and stepped inside the house. He locked the front door, then quietly moved to the back, flipping the breaker. The ranch dropped into darkness. He returned to the front window, just in time to see the first figure emerge from a black SUV. Dressed in tactical black, no badges, no insignia. Buddy growled low in his throat, his stance rigid. Frank didn't move. Not tonight, he whispered. A knock, sharp, polite, echoed through the wooden door. Mr. Delaney, a voice called, smooth and practiced. We're here on behalf of a private security firm. We understand you've recently come into possession of one of our former assets. Buddy stepped between Frank and the door, his growl growing louder, deeper, the kind of growl that came from memory, of cages, commands, pain. Frank said nothing, He just waited. The voice continued. We're willing to make a generous offer. Cash. Clean. No questions. Frank finally spoke, voice like rusted iron. He's not for sale. A pause. Then the voice grew colder. That dog holds sensitive information. He's not safe in civilian hands. Neither are you, Frank muttered and racked the shotgun. Outside, movement. 2 men flanking the porch. Inside, Buddy was still. Focused. They trained you for war, Frank whispered, glancing down at the shepherd. Now let's remind them why they shouldn't have let you go. The moment shattered like glass. One of the men moved fast, too fast, reaching for the door handle. But Buddy was faster. The shepherd exploded through the frame like a missile. No bark, no warning, just pure calculated force. He collided with the man mid-step, teeth bared, body low, driving him to the ground before he could scream. The other men scrambled. Frank stepped onto the porch, shotgun raised. You've got 10 seconds, he growled. Then things get biblical. The attackers froze, realizing too late that they'd picked the wrong ranch, the wrong dog, the wrong old man. Buddy stood atop the first intruder, growling but not biting, holding him in place with perfect, trained control. The shepherd didn't shake or snarl wildly. He waited for the command that never came. The lead man backed toward the SUV, hands raised. You don't understand. That dog, he's dangerous. Frank lowered the shotgun. So am I. They left without another word, tires spinning gravel as they disappeared into the dark. Later, as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, Frank knelt beside Buddy on the porch. You held back, he said quietly. You could have hurt him, but you didn't. Buddy sat, ears forward, calm. Waiting, Frank placed a hand, finally, on his head. Buddy didn't flinch. That's the difference, isn't it? Frank whispered. They trained you to obey, but you chose. For the first time, Buddy leaned into the touch. Inside the house, Sarah Baker emerged from the back room, pale but composed. She'd been helping sort through documents when the attack came. She watched as Frank stood beside Buddy, both silhouetted in the moonlight. We have to go public, she said. Frank nodded. They'll come harder next time. Then we make it impossible for them to hide. The next day, Frank called Claire. Told her everything. By nightfall, they had contacted a local journalist, a former Marine turned reporter, who agreed to meet in secret. Within 48 hours, the story would break across the region. Retired war dog, targeted in attempted retrieval, linked to private military contractor. Photos, documents, testimony, and one image that captured the nation's attention. A scarred German shepherd, sitting proud on a dusty porch beside an aging soldier, watching the horizon like he still had a war to fight. Only this time, it was one he chose. The hearing room in Austin was smaller than Frank had expected. No marble floors, no grandeur, just long tables, stiff chairs, and faces lined with power and skepticism. But it wasn't the setting that mattered. It was who sat beside him. Buddy, wearing a simple service vest embroidered with retired military canine, he lay at Frank's feet, calm and steady, eyes sharp, not out of obedience, but choice. A warrior standing by his partner. Frank adjusted the microphone. His hands didn't tremble. Not anymore. He looked up at the panel. Representatives, military observers, and civilian watchdogs. Most had never met a combat dog. Fewer still understood what these animals endured when the uniforms came off and the war followed them home. My name is Frank Delaney, he began, voice steady. I served in Vietnam. I buried good men, and I buried parts of myself along the way. He paused, glancing down at Buddy, who looked up in return. I thought I was done with war. But then I found this dog, left for dead, at a livestock auction. They called him aggressive, dangerous, broken. Another pause. But what I found was a soldier, one who saved lives, who followed orders, and who, when it mattered most, chose compassion over violence, something his handlers never gave him. He held up a folder. These are training logs, medical reports, first-hand accounts. They show a pattern of abuse in a private military canine program. Dogs pushed past their limits, punished for reacting, discarded when they no longer obeyed out of fear. He set the folder down. They wanted to silence him. They tried to silence me. But here we are. Silence filled the room. Then a committee member asked, "Mr. Delaney, what exactly do you want from this body?" Frank didn't hesitate. Justice. Not just for Buddy, but for every dog they buried in paperwork. Oversight, accountability, and most of all, respect. These dogs are not weapons. They are soldiers, and they deserve to come home too. But he stood, not by command, by instinct. Tall, proud, unflinching. His scars visible, his eyes steady. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because in that moment, no one could deny the truth. They weren't just looking at a dog. They were looking at a veteran. The old barn had changed. Where once dust and silence settled, now stood clean kennels, soft straw, and a quiet stillness filled with purpose. The sign out front was hand-carved, weathered by wind and time. Second Chance Canine Sanctuary. Frank didn't name it after himself. He named it for them, the ones no one wanted. Buddy walked slowly now. The gray in his muzzle had deepened, his steps careful, deliberate. But he still made the rounds every morning, checking the fence, watching over the new arrivals. He was never the biggest dog here, or the loudest, but every soul that passed through those gates watched him first, learned from him. He no longer barked in his sleep. He no longer flinched at touch. His mission had changed, from surviving to helping others heal. Veterans came too, men and women who carried invisible scars. They found something at the ranch they hadn't found anywhere else. Understanding. Because sometimes the only one who truly gets what you've been through is a dog who's been through it too. On a cool autumn evening, Frank sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees and Buddy at his feet. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the fields. He looked down at his old friend. "You did good, Buddy," he whispered. "Real good." Buddy didn't move. He just leaned in, pressing his head gently against Frank's boot. 2 soldiers, still standing, still together, and somewhere out there, a world a little better, because they didn't give up on each other.